Hello, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are. My name is Suat Cubukcu. I'm a Senior Fellow at Orion Policy Institute. For those who don't know Orion Policy Institute is an independent research-oriented think tank based in Washington, D.C. We bring scholars, researchers, and practitioners together to promote good governance and improve policy with high-quality research. Please visit us at orionpolicy.org and follow us on social media. And there's no doubt that we are living in a digital age, and cyberspace has become a focal part of our daily lives. The technology that has improved at warp speed has provided tremendous opportunities for radicals and extremists, and this includes connecting with like-minded individuals and reaching a larger audience to recruit new members and gaining support for their ideologies, groups, and political parties. On the other hand, as misinformation, conspiracy theories, and hate speeches circulate in cyberspace, it provides a fruitful environment for self-radicalization, especially among the far-right. And in today's webinar, we will focus on far-right ecosystems. And we have a distinguished panel of speakers who will discuss the far-right and their use of social media and cyberspace. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Stuart McDonald, Maura Conway, and J.M. Berger. Welcome. Okay, let me briefly introduce our speakers. Stuart McDonald, he's a professor at Swansea University. He's joining us from UK. Dr. McDonald is the director of the university's Cyber Threats Research Center, and he studies criminal law and counterterrorism, especially in cyber terrorism and terrorist use of internet. Dr. McDonald is also lead organizer of Terrorism and Social Media Conference, which was held 2 weeks ago. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Maura Conway. Welcome, Maura. Dr. Conway is a professor of government and international studies in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and she's a professor of cyber threats at Swansea University, and she's also the coordinator of Voxball, a European Union-funded project on violent online political extremism. Dr. Conway is one of the leading scholars in the area of terrorism, internet, including cyber terrorism and online radicalization. Welcome, Maura. And our third speaker is J.M. Berger. He's a writer and researcher focused on extremism and the author of 4 books, including Extremism and Optimal, which is published in 2020. He's a research fellow at Voxball. His research revolves around extremism, terrorism, propaganda, and social media analytics techniques. So we have a distinguished panel, and I think it's one of the most prominent names to be able to talk about this topic. Welcome to all of you. Before starting our conversation, first of all, I'd like to let our audience that there will be a Q&A session at the end, and please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to share your questions with me and with our speakers. And also, I'd like to congratulate our speakers for their recent publication at the ResolveNet on far-right ecosystems in Europe. So it's a timely and interesting research. I'd like to kick off our discussion with this important report, where our scholars analyze the Twitter accounts of 2 prominent far-right parties, AfD in Germany and National Front in France. Congratulations for this research. And I want to start with Stuart. So you are the lead author of this research. Would you please give us an overview of this research?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see some slides. Okay, so thank you again for the invitation to speak today. It's nice to have the opportunity to tell you a bit about the report that you've mentioned. So just first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the report was authored by a team of 7, and 3 of us are in this webinar this evening, but I wanted to acknowledge the contribution of our 4 co-authors as well, who wrote the report with us. So first of all, I thought I'd say something about the rationale for the project. In the context of jihadism, there have been studies that have used Twitter as a gateway platform to study outlinking patterns. And in particular, Maura led a study that looked at several jihadist groups, including IS, and found that they outlinked to a wide range of other types of online spaces. This included other social media sites, from large, well-known ones to smaller, relatively unknown ones, as well as websites, messaging sites, and content hosting platforms. But we felt that there was a relative lack of comparable research in the context of the far right. Studies to date had focused on singular entities, such as extremist websites or singular social media platforms. So our aim in this study and this report was to use Twitter outlinking practices to try and provide a more cohesive picture of the far right online ecology. And we chose in the study to focus on Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and Rassemblement National, RN, in France. We chose these groups for a few reasons. Both groups have previously established ties to Europe's far-right extremist milieu, and political parties like AfD and RN contribute to the mainstreaming of rhetoric, which could drive individuals to engage with REM-V movements. And plus, there is the practical consideration that the increase in deplatforming had made it harder to collect data from followers of REM-V movements. So that was kind of the rationale for the project. And you can see on the screen the front cover that the report is available from the Resolve website. So if I just explain the methodology for the study next, data collection took place in 4 stages. The first stage was to identify relevant Twitter users. So here we identified 2 inclusion criteria. First of all, we looked for users who were a follower of either the official AfD account or the official RN account. And then the second of our 2 criteria was that the user must have posted a tweet within the past 15 days. So that first stage left us with roughly 27,000 users for AfD and 40,000 users for RN. So the second stage was to filter these users. And this had an automated part and a manual part. The automated part had 2 dimensions. So first, to identify users whose biographies contained one of a number of keywords. And then second, to limit the data set to users with less than 1,000 followers or an influence score of over 5,000. And the thinking here was to help ensure a more coherent, lower profile group of individuals whilst retaining the most influential. The next part of this second stage was then to go through every remaining user manually in order to remove any that did not show explicit pro-far-right inclinations. We then moved on to the third stage, which was to collect the last 200 tweets from each of these users. And by the time we got to this stage, some of the users that were identified at stage 1 had had their accounts suspended or they had deleted the accounts themselves. So we removed those users from the data set at stage 3. And then the fourth stage was to extract the URLs from all the tweets in the dataset and to identify the top level domain. And at this point, we also merged host names that were technically different, but effectively the same, such as where you have a web version and a mobile version of the same site. So on the screen, you can see an overview of what we were left with following these 4 stages of data collection. So you've got the number of users, the number of tweets, the number of tweets that contained an outlink, and then the number of distinct links. And you can see that across the 2 networks, we collected almost 22,000 distinct links. Now, within these distinct links, we estimate that there were more than 1,500 distinct host names. And so we made a decision to focus on the top 30 for each network. And we established the top 30 using 2 different ways of counting. So one count looked at the number of tweets that contained each host name, and the other looked at the number of distinct links that contained each hostname. And it's worth pointing out that the thinking behind that distinction was that for each group, the top 30 host names by number of posts was not the same as the top 30 by number of links. And this was because sometimes you would have a single link that was shared in a large number of posts. And this was particularly the case for follower tracking services, where the URL of the service was repeatedly posted automatically on some users' Twitter feeds. So we have two networks and two different methods of counting. And across all of that, there were 58 distinct host names in our top 30 lists. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of my comments is to show you 4 data tables. And just to make things a bit simpler, the slides I'm going to show focus on the number of distinct links. But if you're interested in the findings using the number of posts, that can be found in the written report. So here's the first of the data tables. This table shows the different types of service. So you've got websites, video sharing, follower tracking, and so on. And then for each service type, it shows the prevalence of the service type in terms of the number of host names and the number of links. And there are 2 points that I want to make from this table. The first is the variety of different service types. So some of them you would have guessed: websites, video sharing, social networking, instant messaging. These maybe were guessable, but there were also follower tracking services, URL shorteners, social media marketing and auto posting, online petitions, video streaming, and personal blogs. So quite a diverse mix of service type. And then the second point from this table is the predominance of websites and video sharing. And this is significant, I think, given how much of the discussion in this space focuses on social media. So I want to emphasize that websites were actually the most outlinked to type of service. Moving on to the second of the data tables. So this one looks at the types of content behind the outlinks. So for this table, we took a random sample of 25% of the outlinks for each hostname, and we looked behind the link to see what type of content it led to. And here we begin to learn a bit more about the video sharing and the website content. So in terms of video content, the vast majority of videos were shared via YouTube. There were some videos that were shared via BitChute, but in relatively small numbers. And in the RN dataset, there were also some other videos. The majority of these were from Twitter's video streaming Periscope app. Then in terms of websites, you can see the predominance in the tables of news articles. In terms of social media platforms, there were outlinks to Facebook and to Instagram in both data sets. The RN dataset also included outlinks to a Russian social networking platform called VK. And there were also some outlinks in both datasets to Telegram channels. So then moving on to the third of the 4 tables, this one shows the top 30 host names by number of distinct links. So within the broad category of websites, you can see on this table that most of the websites were news sites. For both AFD and RN, there are 10 what you might call mainstream news sites. So for example, for AFD, there is Bild, Welt, and Focus. And for RN, there is Le Figaro, Le Parisien, and BFM TV. So for AFD, these included Journalism Watch and Junge Freiheit, as well as Epoch Times, Breitbart, and Voice of Europe. And then for RN, these included Valeur Actuelle and F de Souche. And in fact, those two were ranked 3rd and 4th in the top 30 table for RN. Other websites that appear on the screen included the official site of AFD and 2 news sites that are associated with political parties. So these were Compact Online, which is associated with AFD, and Wochenblick, which is Sputnik News also appears in the RN list. And then lastly, there were 3 sites on the table that we classed as disinformation sites. And there was the site VA News Republic, and it was when trying to delve into VA that it seemed to be a combination of manual activity. There was engagement with other posts, which looked like manual engagement, but that was combined with what I believe to be automated activity. And there, I think the automation was evident from the sheer volume of posting activity, 125,000 posts in 11 years, and also from the enormous diversity of online spaces that were being outlinked to, and these span both the mainstream and the far right. So that was interesting to me that you had this account that seemed to be a combination of the manual and the automated. But the other reason for highlighting it was the bio, which you can see on the screen. And I wanted to highlight the bio because of the signposting to other online spaces. And I think this was quite useful just to show the interconnectedness of the different online spaces in the online ecosystem. So then moving on to the final one of the data tables, this looks at the 20 links within the data set which appeared in the most posts. In other words, these are the most shared links from within our data set of roughly 2,500 users. So these were the most shared links. And there are 3 points I wanted to highlight from this table. One is the relatively low number of times each link was posted by one of our 2,500 users. So if you look at the 20th item in the table at the bottom, that appeared in just 16 posts in our data set, and yet it was the 20th most posted link. So there was a relatively low rate of reposting within our networks. Second, once you discount the top 3 in the table, they were all automatic posts from follower tracking services. Once you discount those, 2 of the top 3 are live streams. And I think that's significant. And the first of those is the live stream of a video gamer. And I thought that was interesting given the emerging research on the links between extremism and video gaming. And then the third point to highlight is the nature of the news items. Some of the news items were published on far-right news sites, but not all of them. And what is significant, I think, about how these items are used is the way in which they're used to try and create a specific type of mood music. This is not about explicit calls for violence. Rather, it's the use of news in support of wider narratives that seek to other the outgroup by homogenization, stereotyping, and dehumanization. So that leads me on to my final slide, which is just to highlight some areas that I think are worthy of further discussion. There are many things I could have put on this slide, including the influence of automated activity, the range of ancillary services that are utilized, the fact that these are often provided by smaller platforms. But the 5 points I am going to highlight, and which Maura is going to build upon in a moment. First, I hope that the report we wrote for Resolve shows the potential of an ecology-based methodology. So, as I mentioned at the start, there have been studies of the jihadist online ecology, but fewer studies of the online ecology of the far right. But an ecological approach enables the kind of 3-layered analysis that we've run through in this webinar. We've looked at the top level domains to identify the types of service and ideology. And secondly, we've looked at the technical types of a sample of content, web page, video, and so on. And then third, we've looked at the ideological nature of the most posted outlinks. So this provides quite a comprehensive overview of the whole ecology. Second, well, much of the political and popular discussion focuses on social media platforms. We've seen from the findings I've presented that the far-right online ecology spans a wide variety of different entities and service types. So it's not just social media platforms, there's a wide diversity of online entities and service types. And this leads on to the third point, and this is one of our key findings, I think, which is that websites are a core ecological entity. And this includes both far-right news stories and mainstream media sites. And so I think this is important given the relative lack of attention to websites in both academic research and policy discussion. Fourth, it's worth noting that whilst we came across plenty of content that was anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-Muslim or Islamophobic, what was basically absent from our dataset was explicit calls for violence. And there are various possible reasons for this. First was the fact that we were looking at followers of the official Twitter accounts of two political parties, and so this could have had a moderating effect. And then second, there's our choice of platform. We chose to focus on Twitter. Twitter has increased its deplatforming activity in recent times, and users know this. But at the same time, the lack of explicit calls for violence should not diminish the polarizing qualities of this online ecology. The dangerousness to some users of being immersed in a steady drumbeat of anti-minority sentiment should not be underestimated. It's also significant how mainstream news media are used to justify and rationalize these feelings, and even to try and confer on them an air of legitimacy. And then one final point from me, it's worth noting the value, I think, in repeating this piece of research, but using a different gateway platform. And this would provide an opportunity to test the hypothesis that Twitter's deplatforming activity contributed to the absence of explicit calls for violence. It would also further understanding of the interplay between different platforms and the overall ecology. So that is a rapid overview of the Resolve report, and I'm going to hand over to Maura now to build on a couple of these areas for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I wanted to say a few words about some of those final points that were made by Stuart. The first thing that I wanted to draw attention to is precisely the utility of ecosystem or ecological type approaches. Like Stuart pointed out, a lot of work that is being done to date on the far right, and also the subset of the far right that we might term the extreme right, has in fact focused on some single group, whether it's a far right political party or some far right extremist group, and their activity on some specific, oftentimes social media platform. But we know that no group or indeed generally individuals that are active in one online are active in just a single online space. So it's generally the case that groups and individuals are active across a variety of online spaces. And so ecosystem approaches are useful, we think, in doing it at least two things. So one of them is, in our case, because we did a link, an outlink based analysis, it draws attention to the diversity of different types of spaces that are in use by, in this case, AFDs and Rassemblement National's followers. And the other thing, of course, is that it can also draw attention to the different types of content that these followers are outlinking to. So the types of online spaces on the one hand, and indeed, if you drill down further, the types of content that are being linked to by them. And I would say that one of the interesting things that you can see is that when you do this, when you take this kind of ecological approach, is that the map, or I have a tendency to prefer the term snapshot, that emerges out of these kind of analyses can really vary quite a lot depending on, for example, the type of actor, the type of group, whether it's a political party or a street movement or what have you, that's being analyzed. The jurisdiction in which they're operating. So we looked at a political party operating in France and one also operating in Germany. And an interesting thing that emerged is the way in which there are relatively few spaces where there's crossover between them. So there's a relatively low level of transnationalism, if you like, and in fact, each have their own ecosystems in which they're operating. And then the third thing I would say is that the ecosystems and the snapshot that emerges can also depend very much on the ideology of the groups you're looking at, whether they are on the far right, for example, which is what we were looking at in the present report, whether you're looking at more extreme right entities, or whether you're looking at some other type of extremist, or indeed, if you go further, terrorist entities, which we have done work on in the past also. So the type of actors or groups, the jurisdiction in which they're operating, and their ideology can very much influence, you know, what that snapshot of the ecosystem looks like, what online platforms in particular they're utilizing. So that's one thing that we feel is important to underline, the utility of ecosystem approaches and the way in which it throws up this, you know, diversity of online spaces that are being used. So that brings me to the second point, and one that Stuart also made, and that I just wanted to dig into a little deeper also, which is the importance of websites. That our analysis underlines. There was certainly from the 2010s onwards a major focus on social media and its role in far right online activity. But websites never actually went away. So there was a much greater focus on websites in, let's say, the late 1990s and into the 2000s, but then they were no longer being treated by scholars or by policymakers or indeed by others who might be sort of professionally tasked in this area. But they never went away. Websites have always been, you know, popular vehicles, you know, a popular public face for all kinds of actors and entities, from, you know, small local bookshops or artisans or what have you, to major political parties, to, like I say, extremist groups and terrorist organizations and what have you. So the whole panoply of online actors have tended over time to have websites. And two particular, I guess, types of websites were sort of drawn attention to by our analysis. One was the reliance by these users on mainstream news websites on the one hand, and also the importance of right-wing news websites on the other hand. Like Stuart said, there's a whole array of mainstream news websites associated largely actually with well-known newspapers and also some television in France and Germany. And basically, these websites were being linked to in order to sort of, in inverted commas, bolster evidence as these users saw it for their positions. And so I guess their use of the mainstream news was to show that, you know, there was evidence, even in these outlets, as it were, for their particular positions. And indeed, the far right have quite a long history of, you know, gathering together, again, in inverted commas, evidence from a wide variety of types of sources, but in particular, well-known press and other traditional media outlets to, you know, bolster their positions. At the same time, and so this was evident in our analysis also, at the same time, right-wing websites, including also news websites, but also political party websites and some others, were very much in evidence in our analysis also. Obviously, it should be said that in terms of a lot of far-right news websites do not meet the sort of traditional journalistic standards that we might be familiar with, and often their content is conspiratorial in nature, and some of it can definitely be described as disinformation also. So what I would say in terms of the websites that are thrown up in our analysis is that it draws attention to, you know, the importance of not having too narrow a focus, in particular on, for example, social media, which we've witnessed up until quite recently, and you know that we need to think through to a greater extent the importance of websites, the variety of different types of websites. Certainly websites are much less regulated than social media currently, and so this is an important factor in terms of decision making by these actors around an increased, I would say, reliance on websites over the last number of years. So it means they have a very wide latitude to publish hate, conspiracies, disinformation, and what have you. The third thing that I wanted to underline is that we didn't, it's true, find in our data sets much overtly violent speech or content. But it has to be said that non-violent or not overtly violent speech can still be dangerous speech. So the lack of explicitly violent content in our data set doesn't, we feel like, negate the sort of polarizing qualities of the content found, as Stuart already said. And it's certainly our view that there is a risk that some users who are sort of immersed in this online ecosystem that's producing this sort of 24/7 drumbeat of hateful and anti-minority content has the possibility of turning to violence, because that type of hateful content can certainly have a priming function. And I would point anybody who's interested in this area, there's quite a lot of work done on this over time. A lot of it is about the traditional media, but there's increasing amounts of work also about the role of social media. And just for example, one project is Susan Benesh and her colleagues at the Dangerous Speech Project, and they've done a lot of work about precisely what they term dangerous speech, which they describe as any form of expression, so text or indeed speech or images or what have you, that can increase the risk that its audience will condone or participate in violence against members of another group. And they say that one of the hallmarks of this type of dangerous speech, as they term it, is that the producers of speech tell people that they face some kind of a mortal threat from a disfavored minority group, whether it's refugees, Muslims, Jewish people, the LGBTQ plus community, etc., which makes, violence against these seem not just acceptable, I guess, but maybe even necessary. And they often, and we see this in our data as well, one of the things that they do is they assert that the violence is likely to come from this opposite side. So from these people who are actually the would-be victims of violence. So while we acknowledge that there wasn't a lot of explicitly violent content that was being linked to or shared within the networks that we looked at, there was a very large amount of hateful and anti-minority content, and we don't think that this should be dismissed because of the lack of really overtly hateful content, because non-violent or not overtly violent speech can still be dangerous speech. So maybe I'll hand over to JM to maybe say something more about these kinds of issues and and his position on the extremism issue and related.
Thanks, Mara, and thanks, Stuart. And it's great to be here talking about this. I will just, before I sort of move on to the main thing I want to talk about, I'll just also add my support for the ecological approach. I think, this is something that I've done. I've published a few things on this, and I've also not published a great deal of research on this. So this is a really useful tool to get a quick, and you can use it as we have here in a very rigorous way to really vet your audience and figure out, exactly what you're talking about in very precise ways. And you can also use it as a quick and dirty tool to find out what a certain group of people or network is talking about. And it's, I just found it immensely valuable in terms of, it doesn't substitute for reading into this content, reading into these networks, but it lets you prioritize the material that's really being discussed in the network. And it lets you identify sort of the vectors through which things are happening. So I think there's really, this is just an approach that, over time, if you use it over time, you really get a lot of benefits from it. It really helps you understand sort of how these networks interact and how they're talking about things. So in terms of the main thing I want to talk about today, I'm going to bring up some of them. Let me put some slide on here, and I want to talk a little bit about something that is implied or adjacent to the comments that Stuart and Mara made about the presence of violence and the presence of sort of explicitly extreme content in here. And really what we're getting into now, a situation for our field very generally, in addition to how it played out in this particular paper, is how do we grapple with extremist movements that are part of the mainstream of a society. So putting aside the question of whether they are explicitly or implicitly endorsing violence, about the kinds of actions that they're endorsing and taking, there is a real problem in our field with respect to integrating research on movements that have popular support. And unfortunately, the reasons that we have this problem are fairly obvious. Is that it's very controversial for an agency, for a university or a think tank or a public policy institute that's funded with public money to talk about things that are happening in the governments that they exist under. And so we saw in the case of the United States, where I'm based, we saw what I would characterize as a real institutional reluctance to grapple with the Trump years as they were happening, and to treat some of the things that happened under that administration as being related to extremism. And only after the Capitol insurrection did we really see a lot of my colleagues kind of come around to doing this. And I don't want to, you know, overstate that. A lot of us were talking about it, have been banging gong, and people who are not based in the United States don't have the same institutional incentives. So it was a little easier for them, some of them, to talk about this. But it's not just that pragmatic problem. It's really, it kind of comes down to our conceptions of extremism and what extremism is. And a lot of that, you know, predates the dilemma that I'm describing. So when we go back years to, you know, the beginning of the real avalanche of research on extremism that followed September 11th, and even to the years before that, when there were still fewer, but a significant number of people looking at extremism, we found ourselves, you know, from the very beginning, struggling to define what extremism is. And so a lot of the definitions, there was no single consensus definition in the literature. There's no overwhelming agreement on what extremism is among anybody, but there are some trends. And one of the most important trends in the literature, as people write papers and do their sort of ad hoc definitions of what extremism is that it's the idea that extremism is something that's, as you can see in the second quote here, far removed from the ordinary. So, you know, a really intrinsic element of most definitions of extremism for many years has been that extremism is outside of norms. It is in opposition to the mainstream of a society, and that's a definitional quality of it. And where I think, you know, these are just a few of the examples that I found in doing my literature review for my dissertation, and there are many more, and there are other elements of this that are equally problematic. So, you know, some of these definitions, many of them the most common form, really talk about extremism as being deviance from the norm, being outside the median, having beliefs that are outside of the mainstream of a society. There are also definitions that call for violence or criminal behavior, and those are useful, but they don't capture all the kind of activity we're interested in. It doesn't capture an alt-right network doing an online harassment campaign, for instance. It doesn't, you know, cover the spread of, you know, racial epithets and conspiracy theories outside of an action that is violent. Even though these things have clear relevance to the emergence of violence later, we're categorizing these movements differently because of the lack of violence. And then there's a third group of categories of definitions that are, you know, just come right out and say what these definitions imply, which is that extremism is what the state says it is. Extremism is powerlessness against the powerful, and, you know, that extremism can be defined by being opposed to the state, being opposed to the core values of a society. So I think that we can see how that can be problematic, both from the point of view of, you know, having any kind of desire to make positive change in society, to move the needle in a good direction, and also when a society itself, it starts backsliding, and we're in the middle of that period now. We're dealing with a country here in the United States, with countries in Europe that are backsliding on values and democracy in ways that are clearly affiliated with movements that we understand to be extremist. And if we exclude these movements, these broader political movements, such as the ones we examined in this paper, from our study of extremism, because they are popular or because they are powerful, because they hold seats in a parliament or a Congress, then we're missing out on the most important threat that extremism presents, which is that it may take over your society and result in, you know, the persecution or extermination of minorities of all kinds. And so, you know, I won't belabor this, because I talk about it every time I appear. Anybody who's ever heard me talk before has probably heard me go on about this part, but it is possible to define extremism in a way that gets at the core thing that we're concerned about, which is this in-group, your group can't be successful or healthy unless it's taking hostile action against another group. That action is often violent. That's violent extremism when we're talking about that, but it doesn't have to be violent. It can be discriminatory laws. It can be bathroom laws, as a big debate in this country. It can be intrinsic to or adjacent to laws concerning contraception and birth control and abortion access. All of these things are part of an extremist arsenal, and we shouldn't confine ourselves to groups that are throwing firebombs or crashing planes into towers. There's just so much more activity that we need to be concerned about. And the important part is not just that what we prioritize, but to understand that this is all part of the same dynamics. The same dynamics are informing these behaviors. The flying into the plane versus making a law about, you know, who can use what bathroom. These are all being informed by this kind of identity politics, this kind of bias against one group of people in favor of another group of people, and the idea that you can't, your group, the in-group, whether that group is dominant in society or not, that group has to be taking hostile action against another group continuously in order to survive and to be healthy. So I really think, you know, as we sort of delve into case studies like this, and we look at groups, we look at the two political parties that we examined in this paper, we're really, it's important to really wade into these waters, despite the fact that it's political, despite the fact that it may be controversial, even for us, you know, it's a little easier to go to, for us as parts of English-speaking academia, we can go to non-English-speaking countries and do this analysis as we did here. But we have to be able to turn this lens inward. We have to be able to study how these movements are doing their work in our lives, in our countries, in our societies. And in order to do that, I think it's really critical that we stop giving people exemptions because they have seats in parliament or they hold the presidency of a country. You have to be able to look at this and say, I can see what's happening here. It meets these criteria that we understand to be extremist, and therefore we need to understand it in the context of other scholarship that addresses similar movements. So with that, I will turn it over if we want to have some Q&A or discussion.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for providing this kind of details about your methodology, your data collection, and Maura, you know, the implication of study, and also Jan for providing this definitional challenges, and also how this extremism has turned out to be more mainstream. Please feel free to enter your question to our Q&A function. And I want to actually ask the first question. So you use Twitter data, and we know Twitter is effective in content moderation. So they take down some extremist content, especially they are successful in Salafi jihadist content, you know, the ISIS related accounts. So I'm just thinking whether if you used a different platform like Telegram, where there is no or limited content moderation, would you have come up with a different outcome?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. So each platform has its own characteristics, and you know, some of these differences will be subtle, as in the difference between Twitter and Facebook, or Facebook and YouTube. And the difference, some of these differences will be profound, as in the difference between Twitter and Telegram, where Telegram is primarily being used as a platform for extremists because of its weak content moderation. The difference, the reason we talk about Twitter all the time is that Twitter's API is extremely accessible. So we can get the data to do this research. And with Facebook and YouTube, so there are processes that you can engage in with these companies that are extremely difficult, time consuming, and may or may not end up with you getting some data that you can look at. You cannot scrape the API in an ethical and straightforward way that allows you to do a comparable analysis on those platforms. You can do stuff. There's stuff we can do, and we do, but Twitter just is far more robust in this area. Telegram, I think, you know, the nature of Telegram as a network and how identities and networks form on that platform makes that a completely different kettle of fish from this. It's not at all comparable to a mainstream social sharing network like Twitter. So what you're doing on Telegram really is you're deciding what group you want to investigate. So you say, I'm going to look at atomwaffen division, then you go find Telegram channels. There's no sea of Telegram users you can analyze to find the atomwaffen group in there. So it's a real, you know, there are both structural and data access issues that make this difficult. And, you know, as somebody who's published a lot of stuff about what happens on Twitter, I can tell you there's way too much stuff about what happens on Twitter, but I don't have the way to do it for Facebook. I don't have the resources it requires to do the kind of manual crawling that you would have to do on Facebook to get a comparable data set is just insanely exponentially higher.
And just to illustrate JM's point, I was involved in a separate study last year in which we did look at public-facing Telegram channels of IS and Atomwaffen division, and focusing on Atomwaffen division, looking at the posts we collected from the channels. We had planned to do a similar ecology type study, but there were so few outlinks that it wasn't feasible to do an ecology-based study. They just weren't outlinking from, they were inlinking, they were linking to other sites within the Telegram platform, but outlinking was quite sparse. We didn't proceed with an ecology-based study of atomwaffen activity on Telegram.
And I'll say it is, so you can kind of crack that nut if you're willing to be pretty loose with the terms and conditions of using Telegram and using its API. The problem is, you know, doing academic research under ethical guidelines while doing that. So, you know, if you're somebody who's deeply concerned about the atomwaffen division, there are certainly ways to get that data. But you know, if we're trying to publish a respectable paper on it, then we have a different set of considerations.
Thank you so much. So I have another question, which this is an amazing study, you know, looking at ecosystems, and we talk about kind of limited relationship between the France and the Germany, like from these two different far-right groups, and these are the political party web pages. So to what extent the language barrier play a significant role here? Let's think that like a party from Canada and a party from UK using similar languages, would you expect a much more higher interaction between these two networks?
Yeah, so there is definitely a language issue. I and some other colleagues did work many years ago that certainly sort of showed this to be a significant issue within. At that time, we were looking at the extreme right and on social media networks. But I don't think that's the only factor in play here. Actually, for me, what I would say is probably equal or greater factor here is the fact that we're looking at political parties, and political parties operate generally, but not always, but really a lot within a single jurisdiction. And they have importantly associated with them voting or what have you within that jurisdiction. And so for that reason, when you look at political parties, they do, even online networks and what have you, they have a tendency to be boundaried by the same boundaries in large part as those within which the party itself is operating. So basically what I'm saying is that Rassemblement National is essentially a French political party. AFD is a German political party. And so it's not all that surprising that the followers of one are largely Germans in Germany, and the followers of another are largely French people in France. Now, that's not wholly the case. For example, you do see links to, for example, in the case of AFD, Austria, for example, appearing and what have you, and that's because of the accessibility, because they're both German language speaking. But nonetheless, in our particular case here, I would put it down to the political party aspect. It's certainly the case, on the other hand, that with other far right and also extreme right online activity, you can see much greater links, and I would say faster transmission of ideas and content and what have you across, for example, North America, the UK and Ireland, Australia and New Zealand, and then trickle down often, if you like, or the extension to other countries more slowly. And this is because the countries that I've just mentioned all share English language. And again, in past research, one of the things we could see was that other countries where people had high levels of English language literacy, but it wasn't their native language. For example, in Europe, the Scandinavian countries and also the Netherlands, where many people speak near native level English in addition to their own languages, you can see that they are more active than some others too. So I'm not dismissing language. I think it's quite important on the one hand, but in this particular report, I don't think that it's the sole explanation. I think probably the main explanation is the political party one.
Thank you, Maura. So we have another question from our audience, and I think it's a great question because we are studying online extremism for more than decades, all of you, and this is a kind of a general question. And the question is, when it comes to policy area dealing with far-right discourse and hate speech becomes much more complicated, what would be some other policy recommendations you might propose to deal with this problem? So it's not just about your recent research, but in general.
Well, I'm happy to say something about the right to free speech, which obviously is key to policy in this area. The right to free speech is important, and given that we're talking here about news media, it's even more important in the context of the press. So when it comes to free speech, the distinction that you often see drawn is a distinction between incitement to violence on the one hand and ideological discussion and debate on the other. And incitement to violence would be not protected speech. Ideological discussion would be protected speech. So that, if you like, is the kind of conventional distinction. I'd argue that that distinction is problematic in two respects. First respect, I'd argue it's potentially too narrow, in that ideological discussion can amount to a form of indirect incitement. So I think to some extent the dichotomy is a false one, because people can engage in what looks like ideological discussion, but actually, if you look a bit more deeply, it's a form of incitement, albeit indirect. And then the second problem, I think, with that distinction is that it's potentially too broad. In the UK, we have a criminal offence, which is the offence of encouragement to terrorism. And this offence creates the notion of reckless encouragement, the idea that you can recklessly encourage someone to do something. I'd say that's too broad in scope, and I'd argue that incitement, by its very nature, is an intentional activity. You can only incite someone intentionally, and I would reject the notion of reckless incitement or reckless encouragement. So when you put those 2 points together, I think ideological discussion, where the person that's engaging in that discussion has an intention to incite violence, that, in my view, should not be protected speech. It's a form of indirect incitement. So that would be kind of a policy recommendation, that it should not be possible to use a free speech argument to seek protection for ideological discussion where you have an intention to incite violence. The difficult thing, of course, is when you take that into the online domain and you're just looking at a tweet, trying to discern the user's intention just from 280 characters in the tweet can be incredibly difficult. So I suppose, again, that might point to a more of a contextual approach where you're looking at the user and you need to look more widely at their pattern of posts and maybe other kinds of signposting activity and outlinking activity to discern something more about the intention with which the user is posting. But for policymakers, I probably would say that incitement to violence versus ideological discussion is not a good distinction to found these discussions on.
I would just add, I mean, you know, where this gets complicated is that it's obviously very possible and indeed common for people to use language that is clearly meant to incite violence and other bad behavior without explicitly doing so. So where reckless is a useful category is that it terminates the debate over, oh, I didn't mean for them to storm the Capitol. I meant figuratively they should be fighting for, you know, and so it's very difficult to sort of figure out how those things play out and where to draw lines that are useful enough to take care of problems that we clearly have. And then I would just also say that you know, if there's a policy area where we could really urgently use some work, some research and exploration, it's in figuring out where the poles of authority are in this field. So we have three major sort of clusters of authority that do not have the same priorities and preferences. And so one is the tech companies, one is the governments that host these companies, and one is those of us who are trying to live in a world that's being shaped by gross negligence from both of those first two. So, you know, who decides and how do we empower, you know, better decisions, and how do we negotiate? You know, I mean, I don't think we want to substitute a corporate oligarchy for the world governments we currently have, maybe in some cases, but you know, I don't think it's like really the outcome. The ideal outcome we're all looking for is for, you know, there to be 6 corporations that run the world and everybody else just does what they're told. So, you know, if we don't start figuring out how we're going to negotiate these opposing or intention parties of interest, then we're really it's going to be hard to make progress.
Maura, would you like to add the last points? Yeah, from this. Okay. We have a couple of questions, but we are already out of time.